If 1878 and 1879 were the early Gilded Age, then 1880 and 1881 represent its full flower and its first serious crack. The United States in 1880 was a country of 44 million people, growing at a staggering pace. Cities like Chicago, New York, and Boston were expanding so fast that city planners could barely keep up. The railroads had stitched the continent together, and factories were running day and night. On the surface, this was an era of national triumph. Beneath it ran a vein of deep anxiety. For a factory worker in Cincinnati or a dock worker in Boston, the ballpark was one of the few public spaces in American life where he could sit, relax, shout, and feel like a citizen rather than a cog in a machine. The game was widely understood, even by those who owned the teams, as a social safety valve, a release of tension that might otherwise turn political. The two baseball seasons of 1880 and 1881 unfolded against one of the most dramatic political backdrops in American presidential history. In November 1880, Republican James A. Garfield, a former Civil War general, congressman, and relative political dark horse, defeated Democrat Winfield Scott Hancock in a razor-thin popular vote election. On July 2, 1881, the same summer the Chicago White Stockings were defending their National League title, President Garfield was shot twice at a Washington, D.C. railroad station by Charles J. Guiteau, a delusional office-seeker who believed he deserved a diplomatic appointment in exchange for a campaign speech he had written. The nation was shattered. The assassination came at a moment when baseball was flourishing as a national institution. Guiteau was tried, convicted, and hanged in June 1882. The 1880 National League season featured 8 teams competing in an 84-game schedule. It was the 5th season of the National League's existence, and it produced one of the most extraordinary collections of individual pitching achievements in baseball history, including back-to-back perfect games in the same week. It was also the year that Cap Anson assembled what many consider the first great dynasty team in professional baseball history. The 1880 Chicago White Stockings were simply dominant, managed by the 28-year-old Cap Anson, who also played first base and batted cleanup. They finished with a record of 67 wins and 17 losses, a .798 winning percentage that remains the highest single-season winning percentage in National League history. They finished 15 full games ahead of the second-place Providence Grays and allowed the fewest runs in the league while scoring the most. They were, by every measure, the most dominant team the National League had yet produced. Stars of 1880, Cap Anson, the greatest player-manager of his era. Adrian Cap Anson was the defining figure of this Chicago team. As a player in 1880, he batted .337, second on the team to George Gore, and drove in runs at a pace that led the Chicago Tribune to propose tracking a new statistic they called runs batted in. It would be decades before the RBI became an official stat, but Anson's production was so consistently extraordinary that later historians determined he led the National League in RBIs 8 times in his career, a record that still stands. As a manager, his innovations, structured conditioning, platoon thinking, a formal pitching rotation, established the template for how baseball teams would be managed for the next century. On May 20th, 1880, Cap Anson did something that had never been done before at the major league level. He alternated Larry Corcoran and Fred Goldsmith in the starting rotation on a scheduled, predictable basis, creating the first known pitching rotation in professional baseball history. Corcoran led the team in strikeouts with 268 and was the primary starter of the two, contributing enormously to Chicago's historic season. He would go on to throw 3 no-hitters in his career. On August 19, 1880, he no-hit the Boston Red Caps 6-0, the first no-hitter in Chicago White Stockings franchise history. In 1880, Troy Trojans pitcher Tim Keefe posted an ERA of 0.86 across his starts, one of the lowest single-season earned run averages ever recorded in professional baseball history. Keefe was just beginning a Hall of Fame career that would see him win over 300 games, and his 1880 season announced him as a future giant of the game. That the Trojans still finished just 41-42 despite that kind of pitching is a testament to how poor their offense was. On June 10, 1880, Boston's Charlie Jones hit 2 home runs in a single inning. The first player in Major League history to accomplish that feat hit is a record that has since only been tied, never exceeded. Jones was a physical, power-oriented hitter in an era when home runs were exceedingly rare, and his double-barrel inning in June 1880 gave him a modest but permanent place in the record books. June 12, 1880, the first perfect game in baseball history. On the morning of June 12, 1880, a young pitcher named Lee Richmond attended graduation festivities at Brown University in Providence, celebrating with classmates through the night. He slept for perhaps a few hours, caught a train to Worcester, Massachusetts, arrived at the park with no time to warm up, and then pitched the first perfect game in Major League history, a 1-0 shutout of the Cleveland Blues that the local paper called the most wonderful game on record. Richmond struck out 5, allowed no hits, no walks, and no base runners of any kind. The only run of the game scored on a throwing error by Cleveland's second baseman. June 17, 1880, the second perfect game. 5 days later, 5 days after Richmond's game, and just 40 miles away in Providence, John Montgomery Ward, the 19-year-old pitching sensation who had gone 47-19 the previous season, matched his rival's feat. Ward threw a 5-0 perfect game against the Buffalo Bisons, becoming the second pitcher in history to retire 27 consecutive batters without a base runner. Ward was 20 years and 105 days old, making him the youngest pitcher ever to throw a perfect game, a record he still holds today. On October 6, 1880, the National League expelled the Cincinnati Red Stockings from the league. The stated reason was a refusal to comply with league rules that banned the sale of alcohol at games and prohibited renting the ballpark for use on Sundays. Cincinnati had been violating these rules for much of the season. The expulsion was immediate and, to Cincinnati's baseball community, devastating. The irony was profound. Cincinnati was the birthplace of professional baseball. The original Cincinnati Red Stockings of 1869 were the first fully professional team in history. And now the city that had invented professional baseball was being thrown out of its own league. The National League in 1881, a league in transition. The 1881 National League season was played under the shadow of 2 enormous events: the expulsion of Cincinnati and the assassination of President Garfield, which consumed the nation's emotional bandwidth from July through September. 7 of the 8 clubs from 1880 returned. Detroit replaced the expelled Cincinnati team. On the field, Chicago defended its title. But the story of 1881 is as much about what was brewing outside the league as what was happening within it. Specifically, the conversations taking place in hotel lobbies and private offices around the country about forming a rival major league. The champions, Chicago White Stockings again. The 1880 Chicago White Stockings repeated as National League champions in 1881, finishing with a record of 56 wins and 28 losses, a .667 winning percentage, to claim their second consecutive pennant. They scored 550 runs to their opponent's 380, demonstrating the same offensive dominance that had defined their championship year. The team drew 82,000 fans to Lakefront Park during the home season. Larry Corcoran continued as the anchor of the Chicago pitching staff in 1881, providing Anson with a dependable starting performance that Chicago's offensive machine needed to convert into wins. By 1881, Mike Kelly was becoming something more than just a great baseball player. He was becoming a celebrity in the modern sense. Fans adored him. His exploits on the base paths. He was considered one of the most aggressive and intelligent base runners of the era, and with great personality off the field. His flamboyance, his stories and quips, his fondness for a good time, all made him irresistible to sports writers. Chicago had the best team in baseball, and Kelly was its most beloved figure. In an era before radio or television, Kelly was the closest thing to a national sports star the game had yet produced. John Montgomery Ward, who had made his name as a pitcher with the Providence Grays in 1878 to 1880, began his transition to an everyday position player in 1881 after a series of arm injuries began limiting his ability to pitch with the same devastating effectiveness. Ward was brilliant enough as an athlete that he could simply move to a different position, eventually landing at shortstop, and remain one of the best players in the league. But 1881 was a transitional year for him, a reminder that even the most dominant arms in baseball history are not immune to the wear and tear of throwing hundreds of innings. In 1881, the National League moved the pitcher's delivery point from 45 feet to 50 feet from home plate. This seemingly modest change, just 5 feet, had enormous implications for the game. Pitchers who had mastered the shorter distance needed to adjust their mechanics. Batters who had calibrated their timing against 45-foot deliveries suddenly had slightly more time to react. The change was one of several rule adjustments in the early 1880s that gradually pushed the game toward the modern version we recognize today. The pitching distance would remain at 50 feet until 1893, when it was moved to the current 60 feet, 6 inches. Detroit's Wolverines replaced the expelled Cincinnati Reds in the National League for the 1881 season. Their debut was unremarkable on the field. They finished in a mid-table position. But their entry into the league was historically significant as a marker of the NL's westward and Midwestern expansion. The Wolverines would go on to become one of the more interesting franchises of the 1880s, eventually winning the National League pennant in 1887 with a team that included Dan Bruthers and other stars acquired in a mass purchase of the Buffalo Bison's entire roster. That wraps up our look at the foundational years of 1880 and 1881. Baseball was a different world back then, but the passion was exactly the same. If you enjoyed this trip back in time, hit that like button and subscribe to Thestrikezone 2.0 for more deep dives into baseball history. See you at the next pitch.